Kia ora, everybody. Before lunch, I explained there was a massive amount of people that had taken this elective. Some have sort of gone into the other rooms, which are now full. But I wonder if it's not too much trouble. Could we cozy up a bit? And we'll bring this forward. Catherine's just said she'd rather probably not be up here anyway. So we'll do a bit of shuffling, and then I'll get Catherine to introduce herself. No, the reserved seating at the front is just for you guys. Go for it. Yeah.
You just lost brownie points for saying I needed my microphone. Hey, thank you so much for letting me be a part of today and for coming along, because I think that, one wee caveat is that my day job is in the sexual violence sector, and so whenever we get the opportunity to I suppose, talk to a wider sector in the violence, family violence area, it's a real privilege. But I also want to acknowledge the wisdom in the room, because certainly there'll be things that I know really well that potentially you don't, but there'll be also things that you know really well and I don't. So because we are, a more intimate group now, please pop your hand up and ask questions and make comments if you feel as though some of the information doesn't feel as valid, or you feel as though you've got something to add. Yeah. So just to introduce myself, I'm Catherine Gallagher. I'm a clinical psychologist by trade, and I'm here as the clinical practice manager at START. So a little bit about START. So START, we just celebrated 30 years of service last year, and we're a small NGO that currently resides in Innes Road. So if anyone has some land for us, is that what I'm saying? Any opportunity? Oh, good. So we are, we've often made a lot more noise for than our shape or our size would actually suggest. So we are actually only 11 part-time staff and an administrator in terms of who make up our numbers. But we have, I suppose, 4 main tasks, 4 core jobs. One is the working with people who've experienced sexual violence across the age range. One is consults, so if people have a question or a query around sexual violence, then we're at the end of the phone or the end of an email, or you can come in and have a face-to-face, and that's members of the public or professionals who have a question about clients. The other one is this, community education. So we have the real privilege of going out and talking to lots of different diverse groups. And it's interesting, Maggie, my compadre over here, Maggie Tarakana, what we observed the other day is so much more of our work now is less about what START does and more talking more generally around trauma and the impacts of trauma, and talking to professionals and people working with the families. And what's really nice about those conversations is that we're all working with the same client groups, and a lot of schools of thought and a lot of different disciplines are kind of finding out the same stuff. And ironically, it's probably stuff that our grandmas knew in terms of how to be with distressed people and how to be cool, calm and collected. But now we've got some science around it, and we're taking it a bit more seriously. So those kinds of opportunities for joint communication is really, really powerful. And we also have a partnership with the SASC service, the Sexual Assault Support Service Canterbury, which provides crisis support in the Canterbury region. Have I forgotten anything, Maggie? No? Okay. And this is us, or some of us. So we had a recent training day, so that's the most recent. And we had some yoga at lunchtime, so we're all in casual attire, with some people hiding in the background. Anyway, so that's the staff crew. So when Blair asked me to talk about, how do we work with children in the family violence space, I suppose my lens automatically went to how do we work with them safely? And for me, to work with them safely is to work within a family system. And if we're thinking about a family system where family violence has been involved, then that's not necessarily an easy task. Yeah? But the lens through which I'm going to be talking today is how do we shore up that? Why would we shore up that family system? What's so important about it? And how might we do that? Now, I'm aware this is a really big topic. So this certainly isn't hopefully the start of this conversation for people. And certainly I hope it's not the finish of this conversation for people. But if people have a few ideas, a few seeds planted, and this provokes conversations in your work settings and provokes you to think about this stuff a little bit more, then job done. Yeah. So why do we actually need to focus on children? Because in that family violence space, it's often the parents who are whacking each other or someone's being hit. Well, as the evidence would suggest, 70% of family violence offenders takes place where there's a child in the household. Now, this might not be of any news to you. Yeah? Estimates have as many as 275 million children worldwide affected by family violence. Again, probably not news to you. And let's be really clear that, of course, family violence doesn't always include physical violence. So as we know, it also includes toxic, controlling and neglectful environments and all of those things that happen that are just as powerful, if not more, than actually the physical aspect of it. So researchers and clinicians have always been really good at, I suppose, bringing into the lens the children who've been hit. Yeah? So if ACC covers people who have been, kids or people who have been hit by physically damaged through family violence, researchers tend to have that in their surround. But for a long, long time, there was that sense that if you only just saw it or were around it, then actually you're a little bit protected. Yeah? I mean, working in the sector, what comes to mind when you hear that? The silent witnesses. Absolutely, absolutely. And it may not be a black eye, or it may not be seeing someone you love getting a black eye, but being around that environment, being around that tone, can be really, really harmful. Yeah. But it's a little bit unseen, isn't it? So it's hard to quantify. So you can see how for a long time it kind of went under the radar. So although research still needs doing, what has been done shows clearly that children who live in a home with family violence, where they're seeing people that they love are being hurt, are at increased risk of experiencing emotional, physical and sexual abuse at some stage in their lives, of developing emotional and behavioural problems, and of increased exposure to the presence of other adversities in their lives. So this is a big deal. Are people familiar with the ACE study? So the Adverse Childhood Experiences. It's worth Googling if you haven't, because I think what that study showed is that, again, similar to this, is that people who, again, are often our clients, and actually often ourselves and often our colleagues, when we've been exposed to these difficult kind of experiences, that is correlated with these kinds of outcomes. So the single biggest predictor of children becoming perpetrators or victims of family violence in life is growing up in a home full of family violence. Now, I'm aware I use the word perpetrator, victims. I'm probably going to get those words wrong, potentially in terms of what feels like the right word for you to describe that. So another caveat, I'm adding them as the list is getting longer. I hope you know what I mean. But if there's languaging that you'd prefer, let me know. But otherwise, hopefully just show me a bit of grace, maybe, because I may not be using the right word that fits with your kaupapa. So what are some specific impacts in terms of children who may be exposed to seeing, hearing, smelling, witnessing family violence? Told you you're going to have to work for this. Would you like me to? Trauma, yep. What else? Learned behaviours, absolutely. Yep. These kids find it really hard to manage their big feelings.
And anxiety.
Yep. So they're learning how to keep secrets and not the kind of secrets we want them to be keeping. Yep. So they're role modelling behaviour, they're acting out. And there's those issues with peer relationships. Normalising. Yeah. So this becomes the norm. This becomes their what we grow up in is what we learn and what we know, isn't it? Yeah. So I kind of separated them out a little bit just to build on that conversation about what are some direct effects. Now, this is available if people want to have this handout, this PowerPoint, by the way. So if you contact Blair or someone in the organising committee, I'm sure that it's no problem for it to be handed out. So the direct effects, these have kind of been covered. Kids can see stuff that traumatises them. And let's be really clear about trauma, because trauma is not just being really scared. Trauma is when someone had an experience that they felt completely overwhelmed by, and that they felt that they or someone they loved, life was in danger. Yeah? The reason I'm clarifying that is I think trauma, even though it's great for it to be in our vernacular, it's great for us to be more aware of the effects of trauma, one of the risks of that is that we tend to use that word too often. And what do you think might be a downside of overusing the word trauma? Yeah. We can minimise it. I've heard parents say, oh God, I can't take them to the dentist, it'll traumatise them. Yeah, it can become a diagnostic label without the accuracy behind it. Now, I'd far prefer to someone have trauma in their lens when they're looking at a behaviour and not to discount it. But I suppose I'm just being cautious around if we overuse it, there is those risks. And I think people aren't often going towards helping kids with behaviour because we're worried that we might do harm because there might be trauma attached. We can do some more talking about that. So kids can learn to lose trust in both the violent and non-violent parents' capacity to protect them because they haven't protected them. In other words, they struggle to feel physically and psychologically safe. They can learn that violence is an appropriate way to handle situations, as someone said before, or the converse, that violence is inevitable. So whatever I do, I'm probably going to get whacked, or whatever I do, this is the life that's kind of the life pathway that's kind of in front of me. So this is what I need to expect. So living with stress and fear can impact on other aspects of functioning, as having to focus on surviving tends to get in the way of thriving. So children who live in fear find it hard to concentrate, learn, make decisions, engage well with friends, all of those things. Because as far as my brain is concerned, if in fact I don't know whether I'm going to be alive, then why the hell would I worry about my algebra homework? Yeah? If in fact my alarm system is on high alert, when people are making noise or banging down desks or that kind of stuff, then how does that feel like a safe environment? Even if I'm in a classroom full of peers and this is actually a safe place to be. It doesn't feel like a safe place to be because what I'm carrying around with me is not a sense of internal safety. Yeah? I'll talk about that some more. So also exposed to poor role models for adult relationships and conflict resolution. Yeah? Certainly I have a number of clients who come out and go, well, I did have a role model. I had a role model of what I didn't want to do. And then sometimes when I'm under stress, I hear my mum or I hear my dad. Now, we all do that, don't we? But, for a lot of these kids, what their mum and their dad were doing were not safe. And so when they're actively trying to not do that pathway without any clear indicators of what a different pathway might be, you can see how complicated that gets. Especially when some of those inbred kind of, deeply held pathways that they're trying consciously not to do come up anyway when they're feeling under stress. Yeah? Because how hard is it to hold on to a new behaviour when we're under pressure? We tend to revert to form, don't we? Any other direct effects that I... So there's also indirect effects. So the non-violent parent's capacity to parent effectively can also be impacted, not surprisingly, if they're busy surviving. Now, lots aren't, so this is a gross generalisation. A lot of parents manage just fine. But they're managing in really, really extreme situations, so it's not surprising if there was going to be some costs attached, hey? So the non-violent parent might be more emotionally distant or unavailable. Because again, if I am in survival mode, if I'm thinking about life and death, then how do I think creatively about what my kids might need or pay attention to what my kids might need, especially if I'm depressed or traumatised myself or dissociating as soon as there's something that's slightly stressful that comes up because I'm kind of waiting for the hammer to fall. Those parents may be less able to exercise authority and control their kids, especially in the face of violent behaviours and disrespectful attitudes voiced by kids. How many people have heard parents comment on that? That in fact he shows that look, or I'm called that name, or when he gets angry, and this is talking about an 8-year-old kid. You know, I find it really hard to stand up to that behaviour because, you know, I can then be put back in a place where I'm feeling really scared, or just it feels so it's overwhelming. Yeah. Parents can be so worried about the impacts of the violence that they can consciously not set boundaries. That idea that I know these kids' life is shit and that there's so many things that I can't do for these kids at the moment. And so, in fact, to tell them to go to bed and when I know that's going to result in a tantrum, or to say they can't have this thing when I know that's actually going to upset them, then not only is their upset going to distress me, but I also potentially don't want to upset them because I know just how hard that's going to be for them. Yeah, have people found that with families? Yeah, I notice them nodding. The other extreme, I might be so scared that any noise is going to kick off a response from the violent parent, then in fact I have to have a very, very tightly run ship. So certainly we've had kids where they can't play, or if dad's doing shift work or mum's doing things or there's something else going on, then kids are clearly hopefully seen but not heard. And so those kids might be very, very tightly controlled and not be able to just be kids and make noise and make mistakes. And the safe parent or the non-violent parent can also be the target of blame. Because, you know, when we're stressing out, do we tend to go towards the scary person and say, oh, don't do that again? Potentially. But more often than not, we go towards the person who's safe. If we think about research from the earthquakes, teachers, principals, doctors, you know, people who are safe people in our community copped a whole lot of crap from people who are having stress in their lives and they don't quite know who to take it out on. So who do we take it out on? We take it out on the safe people. Yeah? Which doesn't feel so nice if we're one of the safe people. And this might go without saying, but you know, the violent parent and their influence. So the children also miss out on time and support from the violent parent as they are often less emotionally available, engaged. And often the children are going to split off those beliefs because that idea that dad or mum is someone who I love and I want to attach to and is important can also do this harm, can be really psychologically confusing. And again, if we go back to that last slide, that idea of blame, that I might actually have to hold dad or mum, you know, who's the violent parent, in this space of being a good parent, and I might actually put them on a pedestal a little bit. Because in fact, actually to I suppose, fully comprehend the harm they're doing is a wee bit too much for a child's brain to comprehend, in fact, often for other people's brains to comprehend as well. So the not so great stuff gets split off and not really paid attention to. Have people had that experience or any questions around that? So other stresses for family and parents are also common and can compound the situation. So you know, often these, again, gross generalisations, because we know certainly at start, as Maggie's been quoted as saying, there's not a school uniform that hasn't walked across our threshold. And the same would be for family violence. Sometimes those higher socioeconomic groups don't come across our particular thresholds because they would tend to try and keep things in-house and do things differently. But that does not mean that there's not family violence happening in those environments. Often lower socioeconomic stress, substance abuse, social isolation, housing instability. There was a list done once, clearly by psychologists who had too much time on their hands, who listed the most stressful things in the world, things to be aware of and and shifting house, I think, was kind of 1, 2, or 3, up there. So you want to add to that all this other stuff going on, then these kids are having to deal with shifts in school, shifts in houses, not quite knowing where they're going to sleep that night. And when I go to sleep, actually, can I go to sleep and know that things are going to be safe when I wake up in the morning? We know that the child's age makes a difference and can impact on their understanding and responsibility they take over the situation. Little ones tend to be very egocentric, which is great if good things happen. Like, I am the centre of the universe, and if so, if my party's great or if something great's happening, that's all about me. But the converse is true. If mum and dad are fighting and actually there are some scary things happening, then cognitively, thinking-wise, it's really natural for me to think that's all about me. Yeah? Even though they might be told otherwise. From a developmental point of view, it makes a lot of sense to be all about you as a wee one. And we know that the younger and more prolonged the exposure, the greater the impacts. Now, we used to believe that, isn't it lucky? Isn't it lucky when something horrible happens to someone and they can't speak? And there's so little that they actually won't remember. Yeah, has anyone ever heard someone say that? Like, isn't it lucky that they were just so little? What do people know about that? Absolutely. So we know that the brain develops sequentially, and and it's the lower primal areas of the brain, the more hardwired parts of the brain are developing first in mum's tum. And so, as you said, even in utero, if they're exposed to mum's stress, that is having some impacts on brain functioning. And if those impacts are prolonged and repeated, then that can create differences in brain function. And the interesting thing is that the younger the child is, the more diffuse those effects. So if I happen to be 12 or 15 or 25 and something horrible happens, then I've got 25 years of walking around in this world feeling pretty okay about myself, pretty solid relationships, and then something shitty happens, and I can kind of go, look, I'm okay, my relationships are kind of solid, but there are bad people in this world. Yeah? Now, I'm not saying that's easy, because clearly we don't want horrible things to happen to people, but unfortunately we know that they do. But if I'm one, and actually I'm still forming my sense of myself in this world, and the person doing harm is the person who's also the person feeding me and putting me to bed at night, then actually my sense of safety in this world, my sense of relationship, my sense of actually, is actually seeking out love a safe thing to do, or does that actually make me vulnerable? So we see lots of kids who are impacted by early trauma, but it's less obvious, it's more diffuse. These are the kids who are dysregulated in the classroom and don't quite know, we don't quite know why, they don't quite know why. And imagine how scary that would be, that you go into a situation, you don't quite know why, and suddenly you feel petrified. What's a little kid going to do? Play up. They're going to utilise the strategies that are available to them, and often playing up is what gets me out of that space, or shutting down, or a whole lot in between. Now, there's a lot of kids who are dysregulated who aren't traumatised, so we want to make sure that we're not overseeing this. But it's a pretty safe lens to look through if you're a teacher or someone in those environments. So preschoolers tend to show this stuff up behaviourally, socially, and often with tummy pains and aches and pains. School age, again, of course there is crossover. Social functioning and school performance. In adolescence, we've got social functioning and identity formation, because those are those key developmental tasks that are happening at those ages. So you can imagine that when my resources are having to go into survival, then don't have the energy to go into managing these other tasks that are really important for me in terms of development. Now, let me be really clear, and hopefully this is a message you get, certainly as we go towards the end, this doesn't mean these kids are stuffed. I was doing a talk the other day, and the conversation of the in utero effects of the Christchurch earthquake came up. And the big concern is that, again, we've got lots of little 5, 6, 7-year-olds who are wandering around pretty dysregulated, and there's been some suggestion that might be linked with exposure in utero and whatnot to the Christchurch earthquake. And the worry is that we've kind of got this stuffed generation. That probably wasn't the term they used. But the reality is that, yes, brain changes will have occurred as a result of exposure to those situations. But if we know that and we can be prepared for that, then in fact these kids can go forth and have corrective and really supportive experiences which help them deal with that stuff. Yeah? So it doesn't mean it's across, end of story. It just means when it helps us to understand and be exposed to that. But clearly more research is needed. And gender can also make a difference. So of course, again, I keep talking about generalisations, but you know, some studies have shown there are some gender differences, others say not. The one we often hear about is boys will externalise and girls will internalise. Not always the case. In fact, I was actually talking to someone this morning about gender changes, because often we talk about the fact that boys, you know, manage their stuff in the playground through, you know, a punch and off I go, and then we're mates again, or I might take the aggression out on the playing field. But what schools are finding is a lot more boys who are getting into that kind of bitchy, kind of upset, kind of girl stuff in terms of being upset and kind of being mean to each other and using their words in not such a helpful way. So we're kind of getting gender neutrality and gender crossover in not so helpful ways sometimes. But despite the potential differences, both genders are equally susceptible to being bullied and intimidated. Yeah, so this creates a vulnerability and potentially to doing the bullying and intimidation. Yeah, have people noticed gender differences in the kids they've worked with? Okay. I was saying I did a talk last week with a whole room full of psychologists, and I said they didn't say anything. So come on, there's pressure. Start talking. Okay. So that's that flip side, I suppose, of the boys potentially taking on some of those female or those feminine kind of characteristics in terms of how they're managing conflict. The opposite is also true. Yeah?
Social media doesn't tend to help either with female gender. They have more access nowadays to that bullying.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
It's quite high in the female gender.
Yeah. And I think as a sector, as any sector working in mental health or in wellbeing, we're playing catch up all the time to the impacts of social media and what the internet is sharing. You know, it can be used for good, can be a power for good, but it certainly can create a whole lot of harm. Yeah. So, what can we do about it? I don't even know what that map depicts, but I was trying to find something that looked really complicated, so good luck to you. So it's really a direct and causal pathway leading to a particular outcome. So it's not like we can take a pill and experience this kind of outcome. Yeah? As circumstances are different, individual characteristics are different, and children will continue to be active in their participation and their interaction with what's going on around them. They're not just a lump of clay that the universe and environment kind of shapes up and they stay in that space. They're continually interacting with and negotiating those relationships around them. So this means that interventions need to be aimed, that are aimed need to be timely, appropriate, individually tailored. Bespoke. Have people heard that word? It's the new word. There we go. Bespoke. In terms of building on those resilient blocks in the child's life. So one of the most important blocks is social connection. Yeah? So people are social beings, and a strong connection to someone, is one of the strongest antidotes to stress. Yeah? It's that simple, potentially. So the most important social connection is, in this particular setting, the non-violent parent. So a secure attachment to a non-violent parent or a significant carer, not career, clearly. My spell checker, Maggie, what's the story? Anyway, I always run it past. Has been cited consistently in the literature as the most important protective factor in mitigating trauma or distress. So put another way, mothers/fathers or carers are seen as the child's most important source of help than anyone else in their lives. And I think sometimes we forget that, hey? And I'll talk a little bit about why we might forget that at times as professionals working in this area. So why is social connection so important? Well, you know how I talked about, there are bits of the brain that are hardwired and there's a whole lot of other stuff that's influenced by experience and the environment? Well, one of the things that is hardwired for us is that we turn towards others when in need. So we're hardwired to be social beings, yeah? And if we think about human babies, I mean, they're gorgeous, luckily, because they're pretty bloody useless when they're born, yeah? As opposed to a zebra or some other species that can hop up and skip around and zoom off as quick as you like. Human babies just tend to sit there, lie there, look cute, and cry. And that's because we've got complicated enough brains that means that something in their brain kind of connects in with something, hopefully, in their caregiver's brain, that we then start to develop this relationship. Yeah? That takes time. So if as a mother I'm in survival mode, that's going to be impacting on how well I do that, hey? So as a mother, I needed to have people watching my back. And so if we think about why social interaction is so important, if we think way back when to prehistoric man and woman wandering around, actually if you were in the village where you had time and capacity to focus on the child and someone was feeding you, protecting you, that was going to be a pretty good outcome. The difficulty was if you were excluded from that social group, what was the risk? I think I've got their death. Pretty big risk, yeah? And even though we have evolved and parts of our brains are very, very much more, complicated and evolved as time has gone on, some parts of our brain, the base parts of our brain, haven't actually evolved that much. So they tend to be a bit binary. Am I safe or am I not safe? Yeah? And we dress it up in lots of different ways, but that's what it comes down to. Am I safe or am I not safe? And so for a child, what they're often looking for is looking to socially reference, am I safe or am I not safe? Going back to the earthquakes, who noticed that when there was something going down, an earthquake, you tend to look out to see how other people are reacting. Quite discombobulating to be in an earthquake on your own, isn't it? You're busy going, well, I don't know how freaked out to be. So then we might look up and see a number and go, oh, well, that's how stressed I should be. We're often looking for reasons or things to compare to work out just how stressed we should be, because it's really hard to work that out for ourselves. Yeah? And as soon as someone else looks calm, what do we tend to do? If they're freaking out, it's not helpful. I often talk about my experience of my midwife, clearly not in front of my children because they hate the fact I talk about them all the time. Anyway, but as you can tell, I'm quite a fast speaker, and I tend to think quite fast, as people at work would comment. And when I first met my midwife, she spoke so slowly and carefully that she did my bloody head in, because I was, I think by the end of the first meeting, finishing sentences, Anyway, we got through the preparation stage. What do you think happened when I was actually in labour? It was exactly what I needed, because I was like this and she was just like this. And so that idea of human beings regulating, other human beings is fundamental to what we're talking about here today. Okay. And even though it might have sounded like I was being extreme when I think about lack of social connection causing death, not so much. And I think neglect is one of those abuses that we often don't pay as much attention to. But that's when our calls for social connection, our needs being met are not met, then this can be the result. We just don't grow. We don't thrive. Because we stay in that survival mode and all our energies are being used to feed that system, that greedy, hungry system, survival system. Research shows really clearly over and over again that if we're looking at, for example, post-traumatic stress disorder, someone is much more at risk of post-traumatic stress disorder if they have experienced acts of omission. Now, acts of omission is another word for neglect. So if I have a really scary experience and I haven't got a secure base to fall back on or a sense of myself to fall back on, then you can see how I'm much, much more vulnerable to scary things that might happen in my world. Yeah? So this is not something we want to miss. But it's not a black eye, is it? Yeah? So just going back to attachment. This is the complex interweaving of behaviours, emotions and thoughts that are at the core of our first social connection. So within the primary attachment relationship, the baby learns, as I said before, how to regulate their physical and emotional worlds, and a baby just can't do that on their own. And often what we say to kids, I'm sure, and I've said it myself, we need to teach them how to self-soothe. Yeah, anyone ever used that term or thought in that way? Yeah. And that's fine if we've got a kid who in actual fact has grown up in a pretty safe environment where they've had really good modelling and exposure to a parent who takes their experience and kind of sits with it and feeds it back to them in a kind of bite-sized chunks. Yeah, that's good enough parenting. But what about our kids? A lot of them haven't had that, have they? Yeah, so a lot of our kids have had huge amounts of stress that they've been exposed to, and their models for managing that haven't been great for all the reasons I said before. And so for these kids, you've got the double whammy. And you can see how for them to self-soothe is a really, really tall ask. And we often just tell them it again. And they get in trouble for their lack of capacity to self-soothe. Yeah. So while a parent-child caregiver can't always protect a child from stress, and in fact, I would argue, and a lot would, that we don't always want to protect our kids from stress. Why do you think I'm saying that? Why is it good not to protect our kids from all stress? It builds resilience. What's one of the problems when kids don't get a bit stressed? If they don't get the pass the parcel and they don't get the Freddo the Frog that's in the sorry. I did that. I'm sorry, I did that myself. Do non-parents know what I'm talking about? We changed pass the parcel so that there wasn't just one winner. We're all winners. What's the risk of us all being winners? And unless you can tell the future and predict and promise that your child's never going to come up against a bump, it's a pretty risky strategy. Yeah? But it's one that we seem to be exercising quite a bit. So again, quite often I hear myself saying to parents, go forth and stress your kids, but not too much. So clearly in this environment we're saying pull back, but in other environments it's saying push forward, because we actually need kids to handle and be exposed to a little bit of stress. And in fact, research would argue that people who've had no stress in their lives, when they come up against a difficult experience, can fall apart because their sense of themselves can be, well, actually, if I'm a good person, good things happen, and so when a bad thing happens, poof. And as I said before, when we have people who have had lots of stress, lots of neglect, and also previous trauma, that's not so good when you have another trauma, because as someone said before, this is cumulative, this adds up. So really, we want to aim for that nice middle ground. Bit of stress, bit of hassle, bit of stuff that we work through and come out the other side of. Because if we've never had that experience, then we don't work out that when something horrible happens, we actually have the capacity to get through it and come out the other end. Yeah, any thoughts or observations about that? Just lots of nodding. Okay, so the window of tolerance. Have people heard of that concept? It's a really handy one to know about clinically, but obviously also to know about for yourselves, is that when we're little, the window of tolerance, can't probably see it too bad, but there's a area, sort of a level of arousal that's kind of safe arousal, that hopefully you're all in now, although it's post-lunch, was quite tasty, my voice is quite melodic, so some of you might be nodding. I'll make a big loud noise in a minute. I won't get to stand up. Anyway, so there's this level of arousal that means that our brain goes, oh, whew, sweet, all is well in the world, and so I can start learning and I can start focusing on other things. But given that it's post-lunch, carbohydrate fail, then sometimes we get into hyperarousal, which is in actual fact our system kind of gets under-aroused and actually we kind of shut down a little bit. And as you can imagine, there's also hyperarousal, which is in actual fact when we get activated or get revved up. And in both of those cases, it makes it harder for us to focus on the task at hand. Now, when babies are little, their window of tolerance is about that big. Yeah, if not smaller. If you think about a little baby, they get a bit of wind cry, Be a bit tired, cry. Be a bit tired, cry. And again, the role of that competent-ish caregiver is to get in there and support them to be able to manage that feeling and tolerate that feeling for just a little bit longer. Yeah, or help them through that feeling. So that really what we're doing as a parent is building that window of tolerance and actually creating a bigger space for that child to be actually in good functioning form as much as possible. So you think about a lot of our kids. How big do you think their window of tolerance is? Yeah. And for survival reasons, really important reason, because in fact, how can they be in this world and know that there's not danger around the corner? Because there has been. And our brains have very good memories. Because why don't you think the brain forgets scary stuff? Protection, absolutely. We might forget stuff that we think we need to remember, like when we've studied for an exam, or that person's name where you actually weren't paying attention when you got introduced in the first place. But all of those things that we think, God, I wish I had remembered, but the brain's like, poof, not a priority, or we weren't actually paying full attention like we should. Because I think a lot of our lives we spend in this space of just being busy with our own thoughts. But if that person whipped out a gun or a knife, we'd probably remember. Yeah? And so when something becomes survival-based or safety-based, our brain goes and pays a lot of attention to that. And even when it's no longer present in our worlds, as far as the brain's concerned, if there's the possibility that that thought or that feeling or that behaviour kept us safe once, we're not going to let it go. So if you think for a lot of our kids, the behaviours they've learned to keep alive and keep safe, they're not going to get forgotten anytime soon. So we might spend lots of time teaching them self-soothing and self-regulation skills and all these other sorts of things, and they might be functioning really well. But a stress comes on, and what happens? They're back. And then we can kind of go, oh, God. Maybe we sometimes think they're not trying hard enough, or they're having us on. And sometimes that might be true. But quite often what's happening is, in fact, some stresses come on, and what are they going to do? They're going to revert to form. Because new learning is quite effortful to keep on board. Yeah. So it's quite an interesting concept, that window of tolerance. So again, clinically, you might want to Google it, and there's some, do some more finding out about it, because it's quite a useful way to talk with parents and kids around actually, where are they at in that moment, and help to kind of explain it. Because the other really helpful thing about the window of tolerance is that it's really biologically based. And I read the other day, which made a lot of sense to me, that trauma is actually it's a neurological impact, injury. Yeah? So when people are impacted by trauma, then in fact a lot of the things that they do to survive that moment isn't a choice. If I sat here and said, right, guys, stop blinking. Go on, give it a go. Apart from freaking me out, what eventually happens? You blink. Why? Because you can't not. So we've got kids who say, but why the hell did I just sit there and let mum get hit? Why didn't I act? Why did I just curl up in a ball? Why did I just shut down? What sort of person does that make me, that I couldn't protect my kids when he was yelling at them? Then often what we're doing is providing a bit of science to say, well, actually, you had very little choice in the matter. Because what you did was your brain took over. And it said, actually, this is too scary. And you actually need to survive right now. Yeah, can you see how powerful that piece of information might be for people? Because what are people who've had this experience really good at? Often it's self-blame. I'm feeling guilty about what they have and haven't done. Okay. So the thing you need to know, that even though a secure attachment is optimal, it's the booyah, it's the one we all aim for, children are going to prioritise the attachment to a caregiver, whatever form it takes. So are people familiar with the attachment names? Like we've got secure attachment, we've got anxious attachment. So secure attachment is that idea that in that right balance, there's enough of a sense of safety that I can, if I'm in danger, I can look and mum or dad might be there and I know that they're there for me. And I've had enough experiences of knowing they've got my back that I can actually be out of the room, I can be out of the house, I can be in a different setting, and I still carry around a sense of that safety inside of me. So my internal working model is that actually someone's got my back. And then we have anxious kind of attachment styles, and there's a couple of types. I mean, certainly there's people might understand this in different ways, but two main types. One is anxious attachment, and that is where you've got someone who, actually I need to keep checking. I need to keep checking if mum or dad are there for me because, in fact, I'm not too sure. And in fact, I've learned that if I make lots of noise, and mum or dad might come in to kind of keep me safe, then that's how I make sure that mum's still there for me or dad's still there for me. We then also have anxious avoidant. And the anxious avoidant is that I've worked out that, in fact, mum or dad are not going to be there for me. And predictably, whenever I've needed it, they haven't been there for me. So what do I learn about the world? I learn about the world that, in fact, I'm on my own. And you may well have kids like that or people you work with who just don't need anybody. Now, weirdly, obviously secure, that's the one we're all aiming for, but those other two anxious ones are still preferable to the fourth. The reason they're preferable is I, as a child, can develop a strategy that's consistent. I know that in most cases, mum is going to do this. So if I do this, then the outcome's going to be pretty predictable. Even if that's avoidance or mum overreacting or pulling away or whatever. The fourth attachment style is disorganised. And that's often the kids that we're seeing. And what's so disconcerting and upsetting about a disorganised attachment is that I don't know what the hell is going to happen. So at one stage, mum might be all over me and kind of keeping me safe and actually really all over the top. But within the blink of an eye, mum might detach and actually she's no longer available. Then mum might hit me. Yeah, you can see how for that child, they're going, wait a second, I don't know how to play this. And so again, they're spending their kind of growing time actually having to be on high alert for what's needed for me to survive right now. So with traumatised kids, we're often seeing kids who are in that disorganised phase. Any questions about that? Okay.
We've noticed children that are coming through preschool and their attachments not so much to their parents,
Yep.
it's to their preschool teachers and stuff. So yeah, they're a bit more that last one you're just talking about who, maybe
Yeah.
parent hasn't quite got their role in the whānau set
Yep.
because the primary parenting is actually being done through schooling. Yeah.
It's a really important point, and I suppose that the upside for that is that if they're getting some consistent, good, solid engagement, then those kids can be okay. And with a bit of support, those parents being supported to kind of link back in and pick up those strands can be really, really helpful. But it's a good thing to notice, because I think when we feel a little bit like actually the preschool teacher can make my baby stop crying and I can't, then that can trigger all sorts of things, can't it? Yeah. And in fact, if home is not a safe place to be, then in fact I might at one level prefer my kids to be at preschool because I know at least they're safe. But then at another level, what sort of messages does that send me about it, me as a parent? Yeah, that's a really important point. Yeah, really mixed up. I mean, literature would suggest that if kids have at least one secure relationship, then they're doing better. And so, whoever that can be, clearly, ideally, it's a parent. But if it can't be the parent, then we're looking for at least one in there, and that could make a huge difference. So the fight, flight, flees response. I mean, again, one of the upsides of being in Canterbury is most of us know this stuff, and it's a really handy concept. And as parents get this, people get this, that idea that we have an alarm system, and that when we're stressed. Actually, did I finish that point before? What I needed to say was, even if your attachment system is disorganised, let me be very clear that for most kids in fact, I would hazard a guess and say all kids, they would prefer a disorganised attachment to no attachment at all. So we time and time again see kids who wish they hadn't told, yeah? Or who stay in situations or go towards potentially abusive situations because, in fact, if this is how I get my attachment, then that is far better for my survival than actually being completely neglected. Which is quite an interesting concept, hey? We go back to that brain picture before about the impacts of neglect. I'd prefer something, even if it's pretty shocking, than nothing at all. Yeah. So when our brain's calls for support remain unanswered, when social connection fails, our brains automatically focus in on that self-protection, and that's where we get our fight, flight, freeze. And this is designed to be a short-term system. This is designed to flare up, keep us safe, wind down. How do we typically turn down our alarm systems? You know, if you've been revved up, stressed, what do we tend to do to calm ourselves down? Have a cup of tea, yeah, talk to a friend, have a cuddle. Yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely, breathe. Very handy to remember. It's a bit like blinking. Well, often what I say to people is their solution is really complicated. You know, it's breathing. The other thing is, as a psychologist, I often say is that, you know, I shouldn't give away a trade secret, but I spend a lot of time telling people they're normal. Some less so than others, but, you know, typically we're in that realm. There is definitely a range. Now, chucking that stuff out there, we all do it, don't we? We all do things to calm down. And when people are going through such abnormal situations, such extreme situations, we can think the solutions required are really complicated. Yeah? But often we actually have wisdom inside ourselves that actually tell us what we need. So for a lot of our clients, it is actually a reminder that, you know, if you breathe, then that actually calms your revs down and you'll start thinking. Now, if that's the only thing I remember from our conversation, that I can take a big breath out and drop my shoulders and I'll start thinking a bit better, that's huge. I don't have to dress it up as anything to do with psychoeducation. All I have to remember is I need to breathe. Or have that cup of tea, because that cup of tea serves lots of purposes. What is that cup of tea serving? You're stopping, you're sitting, you're drinking, you're using other parts of your body. You actually had to go through an action to create it. Yeah? And that's using different parts of the brain, which again put blood flow back into different parts of the brain and take it out of that alarm system space. So at one level it's not that complicated, but it kind of feels complicated, doesn't it? So for many children living with violence, that stress, however, is ongoing. So they never get to have the calm down bit. Yeah. And as I said before, to thrive we need to feel safe. So the body's alarm system is resource greedy. And so unless it down-regulates, unless it gets to have those down moments, then in actual fact these kids are staying on high alert. Yeah. So we get that being in an unsafe environment, being in a scary environment, is not good for development. We all agree on that? Yeah. So one option is that we get in there, we take the child and we take them out. Yeah. Now, that actually has to remain an option on the table because some situations are not and cannot be and will not be safe. So, you know, I'm not saying that we poo-poo that as an option because it needs to be there. And then we might put some supports around the child, and then we might put some supports around the parent, and we kind of work out, are they good enough now? And we'll pop the child back. A couple of times, a couple of different environments. Yeah? What do you think the downsides are of that, given what I've just been banging on about? Yeah, so it's changes, it's disruption. Instability for the child, absolutely. Yep, it's impacting on that attachment relationship. So what we're often doing when we do that is we're underestimating the emotional cost for the child to be pulled out, to lose that attachment relationship. And we're underestimating the power of attachment for good. Because I think one of the challenges for us in the helping profession is that we have a perception of what good looks like, good enough looks like, and then we've got the family in front of us, and they're certainly not looking like that at the moment. And so we think actually we need to bump them up this continuum, and of course we do. We need these kids to be safe. But sometimes our perception of how far we need to bump them up the continuum is different from what that family has the capacity to do. And so then we kind of make a bit of a judgment that in fact actually we're making the call that safety is more important than attachment. Now I know that's a blanket statement and there's lots of differences, so you know this is all about individual cases, but sometimes what we need to remind ourselves of is how do we get good enough and create enough safety within that attachment relationship so that these kids can actually have safety and attachment. Yeah, or more safety and attachment. And we know that harm done in relationships is best healed in relationships. You know, that's the basis of therapy. You're not sitting there talking to a post, you're talking to a person. Because there's a recognition, in the work that you're doing, there's a recognition that in fact being in relationship is what can help us move through and deal with these issues that are going on.
Would there be a, we're talking about the safety versus attachment. Would there be, that safety is part of that, or attachment part of that safety?
Oh, absolutely. And in a way, if I said versus, I didn't mean. So it's not that it's one or the other. It's that how do we ensure it's both.
Yeah.
And I think that sometimes the risk is, though, that we can have a perception that it's safer for that child to pull them out and to form an attachment over here. And in fact, many conversations I've been a part of where people have said, look, we won't encourage them to have contact with their previous carers because that's going to disrupt this attachment. And again, our understanding would be that if they've got security of attachment in whatever, it doesn't have to be with the parent, then actually that's something that we need to be enhancing. You know, it's not something that's that's actually disadvantaging that child, but we kind of get that it's complicated, so we want to clean, you know, as an adult, we might think if you've broken up with that person, or there's no future in that relationship, you know, they're not on my Christmas card list anymore. Kids don't tend to operate that way. Yeah. So you've got a child who has that experience of disrupted attachments, which is making forming new attachments much more difficult. And I think our systems find it hard to tolerate that. There might be multiple attachments or attachments that we want to actually foster and continue. And how do we do that? So we know that engaging the non-violent parent works. So what gets in the way? What do you reckon for the non-violent parent, the safe parent? If we're saying to that parent, hey, we really want to work with you so that you can be the best person in your kids' lives to help them get through this experience, what might be some things that are said or not said, but felt, that get in the way of that non-violent parent picking up this piece of work or picking up this ball and running with it?
Fear of repercussions from the other parent?
Absolutely. So they might not feel safe enough to do that, just to make a stand. Absolutely.
Their own mental health?
Their own mental health and well-being, yep. So what you're saying might make sense to me, but actually I have no idea how I'd find the energy to do that. Or I don't believe I could do that because I don't feel so good about myself. Yeah, what else might get in the way?
Financial issues.
Financial issues? Yeah. So in terms of accessing help?
Well, if one parent has to move the house and they're the main provider of
Yes.
the money in the household, what do you do then?
Yep, absolutely.
Financially, and you've got 5 children.
And certainly we would have this at work. We can get frustrated because a parent is having to work and prioritises it over therapy. I'm being a bit silly because clearly we acknowledge this stuff, but it gets in the way of therapy, doesn't it? But in fact, they're having to work and they're doing shift work, and all of those sorts of things mean that those practical realities can make it really hard for a parent to engage in this work.
Just fear of change generally, even for someone, if you want, losing whatever your goal is, it's hard to enact change and keep it going.
Absolutely. And if we go back to that idea that I might not, this experience of domestic or family violence might not be my first experience of violence. So you're telling me that I can be the safe parent for my kids. My belief around that might be a little bit questionable because in fact if I grew up in a violent home, then actually I've got no role models there around actually any person being able to step up or change. So you might have
Very
these...
much outside your comfort zone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
New relationships.
Absolutely.
Culture.
Absolutely. Yeah. And just going back to that new relationship thing, again, because this stuff even though it's pretty basic what we're asking for, it takes effort and energy. And sometimes to get into the nitty-gritty, I mean, you mentioned before about losing weight or doing whatever. I mean, we all know it's more exercise and less food, don't we? But how many ways do we dress that up? You know, and how many people buy gym memberships and then just don't use them beyond the first couple of weeks? You know, so we actually know this stuff. Who's lied about the physio exercises they've done before they go to the physio, or does a few in the car park? Or you weren't actually doing them for the whole month that you were supposed to be. We don't do stuff we should, do we? Yeah, and that's hopefully with most of us being unreasonably good nick. So if we're in all these other things going on, it makes it much, much harder. Shame's a biggie. You know, I'm sitting here with you looking at my family, looking at my parenting, and I am found wanting. I'm found wanting in your eyes. I'm found very wanting in my own eyes, and potentially in my own kids' eyes. So how does that shame not debilitate me and make it really hard for me to move through this? And shame's often something that's a little bit invisible. Shame's not screaming from the rooftops. Shame is just the shutdown. And what do we often, when we see that behaviour, what can it often look like? Disengagement. Yeah? Not showing up. Resistance. Being off their face. You know, potentially because if I'm actually dissociating or I'm not even in the room, there's a whole lot of ways that we can see shame. And unless we address it and notice it, then it has a really, really, I was going to say sinister, but really big impact on engagement. Their own trauma. So in fact, part of potentially tolerating their child's distress might be being around their upset and doing something a little bit differently. But if I've got my own trauma, if I'm triggered by my child getting upset or them having an angry voice or you know, doing whatever, then in fact, how do I stay in my window of tolerance to be able to use my thinking brain as opposed to reacting? It's a really tough ask. Feeling hopeless and helpless, and as sense of self is worn down through family violence, you know, this is cumulative. I might have started off with some belief in myself, but people have worked pretty hard to knock that out of me, including my own thoughts and feelings. Yeah? Being isolated. So I might leave, you know, your office and go, yeah, I can do this. Then I get home and actually I'm on my own. And it's just same shit, different day. And I'm supposed to do it different. And then I have to turn up at your office next week and either pretend, like in the you know, car park, I might make up some things I did, which I didn't really do. Or I just have to head down because, in fact, I didn't do what you asked. And worry about what impact that's going to have on our relationship. Lack of trust in the system. So you're here now, but you know, when the going gets tough, off you go. You won't be here for me. Yeah. And lack of positive parenting role models. You know, how do we know how to do this stuff if we've never had it role modelled for us? Yeah. What about for the child? If we're saying to the child, hey, you know, we're going to work with mum because it's really important that mum or dad is able to be there for you and help you with these big feelings. Yeah? What resistance might you find from the child? What might be going on for that child? Yep. Yep. So the actual violent parent, they might be thinking, actually, I'm not going. You know, if I align with this, I'm kind of, you know, disrupting that. Absolutely. Yep. So they're seeing themselves as responsible. What else might be a player for the child in terms of if we're selling this to the family around this is our way forward, we're going to help you deal with these big feelings, but we're going to do it with mum or with the, you know, the safe parent. We're going to do this stuff together. What else might get in the way?
I think the age of the child is really important too, because up to a certain age they won't have any concept of what you're talking about.
Yep.
So it depends which age.
Absolutely. But then past a certain age, they'll be thinking, I don't want bloody mum in the room.
Yeah. Number of siblings, like other kids in the family, where
Yep.
what their pecking order is the eldest, youngest, and
Yeah.
so other kids living, having left the home.
Absolutely. Those other influences and where they fit, what their
Whether
sense of
they've got
self.
siblings and who got more slack versus others. And
Absolutely. Because kids have got this little radar for fairness, haven't they? Yeah. Yeah. So I've got their blame towards the parent for not keeping them safe, because I might be bloody angry at you for the fact that our family's fallen apart. And now you're stepping up? Yeah. I might have fear, as you say, in terms of what might happen if mum steps up, if mum actually starts to be stronger. What's the risk with that? If mum actually leaves dad, what's the risk with that? We know it's a really big risk. I might see the non-violent parent, the safe parent, as a victim. You know, I've had lots of experience of seeing that mum, you know, or dad being bullied, being stood over, not having any power. So why the hell would I start believing that they had the capacity to be stronger than me or keep me safe? And we don't give over control very easily, do we? Yeah? Because if giving over control means I'm a little bit vulnerable, I'm going to be really cautious about who I give control over to. And am I going to give it over to a parent who's time and time again shown me they can't keep me safe? So for a lot of kids, they're going to be wanting to hold on to that pretty firmly. I might also see that in the non-violent parent through the lens created by the violent parent. You know, the languaging, the beliefs I might have about them, and that's hard to shift. And the impacts of trauma might make them more challenging to parent. You know, because I might actually be pretty dysregulated and be a pretty big handful for people to manage. And what about for us, the professional? What gets in the way of us engaging parents in this work?
Time constraints.
Mm-hmm. Yep, time constraints, resistance. Good point. Physically can't find them. They don't turn up to appointments. Yep, you turn up at their house and you know they're hiding behind the curtain. Yeah. So we're also pretty good at blaming. Because, you know, I'd like to think that we're all a room of non-judgmental people. Tell me who's non-judgmental. Liar. Because I know some of you want to put your hand up. We are designed to be judgmental. Going back to our brains have to deal with millions of bits of data and information on a moment-to-moment basis. So our brain's really good at developing patterns and ways of filtering information so we can go about our daily lives, yeah? Most of those filters are pretty handy. In some cases, not so much. Yeah? Why do you think we stereotype people? You know, we meet people, we make judgments all of the time. Now, hopefully, we hold them lightly enough that we hang around to find out more. But we have to hang around more to find out, don't we? Yeah? Our brain isn't necessarily designed to want to hang around to find out more if, in fact, what we perceive is dangerous. So when we as, professionals are working with these mums or these parents to try and support them to get them back on song with regard to their parenting, and they're resistant and they're hard to engage, what does our brain typically do? Because we don't want to sit with, I'm not very good at my job, do we? Or possibly some of us go there. Actually, often we do, given that we happen to be in this job because we, are slightly anxious and sensitive. And anyway, talking about myself. We tend to say there must be something wrong with them. Yeah? Because that's a safer perspective for us to hold, isn't it? We can have that desire to rescue and take care. So we step in too much, we expect too much, we take on board too much, and then we can get a bit burnt out. We can have unrealistic expectations, so we want these people to do better, and we hold the bar up, because this is what we see and hope that they're going to be capable of, and then they kind of let us down. Yeah, not that we admit that. Our own trauma can get triggered, our own stuff. Lack of time and resources, as you said before, and differences between sympathy and empathy. What do you think I'm talking about there in terms of the difference between sympathy and empathy? What does it feel like when someone is sympathising with you? Feel sorry for you? Yeah. It's an interesting thing to sit with, because sometimes what we do is we veer into sympathy. We veer into, this person's got a really shitty situation, and how am I going to help them with it? And it's kind of like a top-down, feeling sorry for you. How am I going to rescue you from this? And that can create some different dynamics in that engagement which aren't so helpful, hey?
It's also that part of the lack
Absolutely.
of, the worker not understanding the cultural context of where his family coming from.
Oh, absolutely. And so part of that is our own resourcing as workers, isn't it? Is that do we have the support and training to know about what we're looking for, and then when those things come up, how do we get support and resourcing around that? Absolutely. So these challenges need to be acknowledged and worked with. So it's not about finding the perfect solution. It's about how do we find the solution that will work for this child and family, and the system around the child. Clearly it's caused the difficulties. However, the system also can often hold the raw material for things being able to be better. And if we can build up the non-violent parent to step into their role more fully and with support, then their power to influence the outcome is so much more powerful than ours. Yeah? Now, I'm aware that it's probably beyond the time we're supposed to have a break. Do people want to have a quick 10-minute break and then come back? Go! Go now, otherwise I'll start talking again.